Samsung began in 1938 as a small trading company that sold noodles, dried fish, and local vegetables. Back then, it was impossible to imagine that Samsung would transform into one of the world's most valuable companies that produces so much more than you would think. Samsung have created skyscrapers, roads, hospitals, clothes, robots, and far, far more. They even had an aerospace division that created helicopters and tanks for the military. But we'll get to all that. First, let's introduce Lee Byung-chul, who founded Samsung at the age of just 28. He says that one night he had a panicked realization that he was wasting his life, and that it was time to set a clear goal for himself, and so he committed at that moment to building a business. Despite Samsung's humble beginnings selling groceries, Lee always had a much bigger vision. He chose the name Samsung, as in Korean it means 3 stars. Whilst to many of us 3 stars may sound like a mediocre product review, in Korea, the number 3 is very popular, as it represents something big and powerful, and star is used to represent something everlasting. Big, powerful, and everlasting are certainly perfect words to describe what Samsung has now become. But at first, it didn't look like Samsung was even going to survive, as the Korean War had a devastating impact on Lee's business and the entire country. In fact, after the war, there was a shortage of commodities, and Korea was heavily relying on imports. So, Lee decided to diversify his business and create affordable goods for the public. He started by creating a sugar refinery, and then, using the profits from that, he opened the largest woolen mill in the country. This allowed Samsung to expand into textiles, and they began creating finished products like clothing. Since it was diversification that allowed Samsung to survive, Lee decided to keep pursuing this strategy more aggressively, and reinvested the money he made into other new areas, like opening a department store and getting into the insurance business. In fact, to this day, Samsung is the largest insurance provider in South Korea. With all of this rapid expansion of his business, it wasn't long before Lee was the richest man in the country, and he was about to get a lot richer. In 1968, Samsung executives had a meeting where they decided the next market to enter: electronics. A year later, Samsung Electronics was fully set up, and they created a 12-inch black and white TV. Within a decade, they'd become the world's #1 black and white TV manufacturer thanks to their efficient assembly line production. And this success led them to start producing all kinds of home appliances. Like, in 1979, they began making microwaves. In 1980, they started producing air conditioners. In 1981, they produced 1 million color TVs. And in 1983, they got into making personal computers. But they soon realized that to produce all of these electronic goods, they were heavily reliant on importing so many small components from abroad. So they bought a semiconductor company to have full control over the supply chain themselves. They not only used these chips in their own products, but started selling them globally to other electronics manufacturers, opening yet another product line for Samsung. In fact, one of their many customers is Apple, who have used Samsung memory chips in their iPhones, despite the fact the two companies have become fierce rivals in the smartphone market, which we'll get to shortly as well. But what's really fascinating about Samsung is all the industries they've expanded into that you never normally hear about. For example, under a division called Samsung Heavy Industries, Samsung specialise in making giant ships, and are one of the largest mega shipbuilders in the world. There's also another division called Samsung Construction and Trading that makes roads, tunnels, bridges and buildings. Amazingly, the world's tallest building, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, was built by Samsung. And before that, Samsung was also involved in making the previous tallest building in the world. They even own South Korea's largest theme park called Everland, have their own hotels, and own a place in Korea called Samsung Town. So, whilst many of us probably know the Samsung brand from its success in mobile phones and consumer monitors and gadgets, that's barely the tip of the iceberg. We haven't even mentioned Samsung's non-profit foundation, which includes a university and a hospital called Samsung Medical Center. Yep, Samsung even have a hospital. However, the fact that Samsung have expanded into so many industries may sound like an incredible business success story. A young entrepreneur starting with a simple idea, and then diversifying into more and more markets and gradually building an empire. But that is certainly not the full story. The real truth is much more controversial. Following the Korean War, South Korea was in a very bad state, not producing or exporting many goods. The president was eager to expand the economy and decided to support large Korean businesses by offering them very easy financing and protecting them from competition. In other words, Samsung and a couple of other big South Korean businesses got given extremely favorable loans, special tax breaks, and a bunch of other support measures from the government to help them expand. The idea was that by helping these big companies grow a lot larger, it would help the overall country's economy. For example, right after Samsung started working on electronics, the South Korean government banned several other countries like Japan from selling electronics in South Korea, pushing consumers towards Samsung products instead. Around this time, the South Korean government also reduced taxes by 50% on companies operating in the electronics business. But here's the thing, Samsung was by far the biggest company in the industry at the time, by a huge distance, and so they benefited way more than anyone else. In fact, the government was essentially funneling American relief money that South Korea received after the war straight into Samsung, and this is what allowed them to expand so rapidly. And this was all thanks to Samsung's founder Lee, and his ability to make very strategic political connections, like becoming good friends with South Korea's presidents. As a result of this friendship, Samsung continually got special treatment, like they didn't have the same export limits other companies had. There was also another incident where government-associated banks started offering Lee extremely generous credit terms so that Samsung had more money to fund their expansion plans. But when Lee got the money from these banks, he used some of that money to start buying those same banks who had given him the credits. Now, to be fair, it's true that by the government helping Samsung so much, in many ways, it helped the whole of South Korea's economy, especially because Samsung employed huge amounts of people as it grew. But the government's favorable treatment of Samsung often ended up hurting other smaller Korean businesses. How could anyone compete with a government-supported conglomerate with such vast resources and wealth? Samsung could crush anyone they wanted when they entered a new market, which meant that some viewed Lee as a symbol of corruption. It could also be argued that by helping Samsung so much, the South Korean economy is now over-reliant on one single company. If things go bad for Samsung, it could have a terrible effect on the entire nation, especially because Samsung is so heavily involved in so many different industries. In fact, a study in 2014 found Samsung composed about 17% of the entire South Korean economy. You see, Samsung is one of South Korea's chaebols, a Korean term that refers to family-owned conglomerates that have built giant empires through close government ties. There are a few others like LG and Hyundai, but Samsung is the largest. And basically, because these business empires are kept within the family, it means that just a few families in South Korea hold a vast amount of the country's wealth, power, and influence. So, when Samsung's founder Lee Byung-chul died in 1987, his son, Lee Kun-hee, took over the business. And this is where Samsung's ties to the government get even more controversial. Firstly, in 1996, Lee Kun-hee was charged with bribing a former president. However, because of Samsung's government connections, the president at the time pardoned him with no further action taken. Then in 2008, Lee Kun-hee was accused of managing a political slush fund, which was used to bribe prosecutors and politicians. He was found guilty of tax evasion and embezzlement, to which he apologized and stepped down from the company, but there was no jail time. And within just 2 years, the new South Korean president had pardoned him, and Lee Kun-hee went back to work as the chairman of Samsung as if nothing had happened. So, on 2 separate occasions, Lee Kun-hee had been charged with bribery, corruption, and tax evasion, and on both occasions, he received no jail time and was pardoned of all wrongdoing, despite the overwhelming evidence. This just shows how tightly Samsung and the government are connected. Even when publicly convicted of a crime, the president can just reverse it. And this goes even further. In a controversial book entitled Think Samsung, written by Samsung's former chief legal counsel, it was alleged Lee Kun-hee stole around $9 billion from Samsung subsidiaries, destroyed evidence, and bribed government officials to guarantee his son would succeed him as the head of Samsung. In addition, several presidential candidates and aides have reportedly been given bribes by Samsung. Now, Samsung denied some of these claims, and most of South Korea's media refused to even mention this book, because Samsung is such a huge part of the country that an attack on Samsung can be perceived as an attack on South Korea itself. Plus, it's very possible the media simply didn't want to get on Samsung's bad side, given how powerful the company is. For example, in an article titled South Korea, the Republic of Samsung, the author suggested that Samsung's chairman is more powerful than the president of South Korea, and that many Korean people have come to think of Samsung as invincible powerful and above the law. Essentially, the company has vast influence over the government, media, and entire country. And just to make things even more absurd, when eventually Lee Kun-hee's son took over after him, he was also found guilty of embezzlement and bribing politicians, just like his dad had been. Now, I really want to stress that we're talking about the actions of a small number of individuals here. Samsung is a giant conglomerate of hundreds of thousands of employees, so it's obviously unfair to tarnish all of Samsung with the actions of just a couple of people. Plus, clearly Samsung have done plenty of good in South Korea as well. But I do think it's interesting that once you see the kind of shady backroom dealings and bribery that went on, and the deep ties to the government, suddenly Samsung's success story isn't quite the fairy tale it may have seemed in Chapter 1. However, we're not quite done yet, because no story of Samsung would be complete without us looking at one of the biggest disasters in Samsung's entire history. Imagine waking up in your room only to find it filled with smoke. There's an awful smell and you're struggling to breathe. You look over and see that your Samsung Note 7 smartphone is on fire. Scenes like this played out multiple times around the world in 2016, and airlines soon banned the phone from flights. What's concerning is Samsung knew about several of these incidents and initially did nothing. They were extremely slow to react, and it was only as more phone explosions happened that the media picked up the story and Samsung was forced to stop production and recall the product. This cost them over $5 billion, not to mention all of the reputational damage. To make things even worse, the initial replacement product Samsung issued also had the same overheating problem. That's because Samsung initially blamed the battery as being the issue. But actually, it was more complex than that. It wasn't down to just one faulty component that could easily be swapped out, but instead linked to the internal design and the way the components in the device were basically crammed too closely together. But in many ways, the real root of the problem can be traced back to Samsung's ongoing battle with Apple. If we rewind back to 2011, Apple was suing Samsung, claiming they basically copied the design of their iPhone, demanding billions of dollars, while Steve Jobs publicly called Samsung a copycat. Samsung felt this was ridiculous, given that Apple had taken plenty of inspiration from competitor products themselves over the years. But Samsung executives were determined to create something new, and change the narrative of Samsung being followers instead of leaders. And thus, they launched their Galaxy Note series, a cross between a tablet and a smartphone. But for the Note 7 model, Samsung executives wanted to add in lots of new features, and they also demanded tight deadlines with very aggressive specifications. Samsung engineers recall that the pressure to make the device on time was extremely intense, and that it became a chaotic rush to finish the product by the deadline. They didn't realize it at the time, but basically, in the race to try and beat Apple, Samsung had rushed the product's development too much. They'd crammed the Note 7 with too many features and not spent enough time on quality control. Of course, before realizing the issues, they sold millions of these dangerous phones all around the world and spent gigantic sums of money on marketing it. And as if this hadn't been a big enough PR disaster already, Samsung then tried to suppress information about the whole thing. For example, when people on YouTube created parody videos in Grand Theft Auto with characters using Galaxy Note 7s as exploding grenades, Samsung copyright struck the videos, despite having absolutely no rights to do so. This backfired further, as their attempts at censorship created yet more buzz and controversy around the whole story. However, despite all of the drama, both with their products and with their owners, Samsung have clearly continued to have incredible success. They've created innovative products like their folding phone, they've generated more revenue than companies like Google and Microsoft, and they'll no doubt continue to keep entering all kinds of new markets. Given the very humble beginnings of how Samsung started, it really is quite amazing what the company has now become. And I guess it's proof that with enough hard work, anyone can turn their small business into a giant empire. As long as you're good friends with the president of your country, and they're willing to funnel you millions of dollars of taxpayer money. Now, if you want to hear some really controversial business stories, I think you'll enjoy these videos right here. Just take your pick, and hopefully I'll see you there. Thanks for watching this video to the end, and supporting this channel. You are a legend, and I'll see you in the next one.